And so whether they're Jew or whether they're from the Muslims, the Prophet ﷺ is promising their protection as the people of Zimma, protection, the protected people, and also as already having wala, a protected status with the Arabs of that time. So the Prophet ﷺ does not, and it will be the Jews who are treacherous with this treaty. They're the ones that break it. The Prophet ﷺ never broke that treaty, hasha. So had they maintained that treaty, and the most bizarre aspect of this whole thing is that they align with the mushrikeen, the polytheists, who were their enemies before Islam because they were Unitarians. And so it's a very strange situation. Now, another very eventful experience for the Muhajirin is they lived in Mecca, and people who have been in Mecca know it actually traditionally was a very dry climate, very healthy climate. So the Meccans were healthy people. When they go to Medina, there's a fever there. It's a waba. It's an epidemic fever that comes and people die in it. This fever comes and they all get sick. And the Jews are saying, that this is a sign, right? And also the mushrikeen are happy, which is one of the reasons why when they made the pilgrimage, the Prophet ﷺ did the yattabi'. He put the arm and showed the forearm and his bicep when he was running, and all of his Sahaba did that to show the Quraysh that they were still strong. Because the Quraysh said they got weak in Medina. So he wanted to let them know they still had their strength, right? So we can appreciate that. This is the humanity of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is one of the people to get sick, and both Abu Bakr and Bilal are sick, and Aisha radiallahu anhu, she's still young, she's about 10, she goes to visit her father, and she asks him, Kayfa asbahta? How are you doing this morning? And he quotes this line of poetry, and he says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, radiallahu anhu, that he has woken up in this state, and everybody that wakes up finds that death is closer to them than the shirakun na'al, than the strap of the sandal. And this is obviously sophisticated for Aisha, but she has a phenomenal memory. And then Bilal then adds to it by making another quote saying, will we ever get back and drink the waters of Majannah in Mecca and have our health back? And so she goes back, and the Prophet ﷺ asks, how are they doing? And she says, Yahzuna, they're in a delirious state. And so he says, why? What did they say? And she quoted verbatim the lines of poetry they recited to him. He said he was happy that they were fine. Now, the other thing that happens here is the beginning of the Medinan period. So we're getting the revelations coming down, and of Baqarah and these verses. And obviously, the Jews in this place, there's three dominant Jewish tribes. You have Bani Nadir, Bani Qaynuqa, and you have Bani Qurayza. These are the three Jewish tribes in Yathrib, or in Al-Medina. And then you have the Aus and the Khazraj, which are the two dominant Yemeni, they're originally Yemenis. And then you have some Mawali of the Aus and the Khazraj from other tribes, lesser tribes around that area. And one of the things that he mentions in there is that on page 126, he says, eagerly the Jews had looked forward to the coming of the predicted prophet, not for the sake of spiritual enlightenment, it would bring but, so that they might regain their former supremacy. You see, so this is obviously a different intention here. And when they see that it's from a descendant of Ishmael and not Ishaq or Isaac, who was proclaiming the truth, then they reject it. Now, there's an event that occurs here that one of the Jews, the Prophet ﷺ was once looking for his camel, and one of the Jews said, he claims to know things from the unseen and he can't find his camel. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, I only know what Allah revealed. And then he told him, but, because Jibreel ﷺ told him where the camel is, it's now, right now, in such and such a place. And they went and they found the camel. So, extraordinary things were happening. Another thing that's really important to remember is the Aus and the Khazraj, who were enemies. These people hated each other. They had poetry, long lists of poetry in which they attacked each other in this poetry. They had just suffered the battle of the Bu'as, where they lost most of their leaders, and suddenly they're united. So when you read the verse in the Quran, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, hold together to the rope of Allah, don't separate, وَاذْكُرُوا النِّعْمَةَ عَلَيْكُمْ, right? إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً, when you were enemies, right? And Allah united your hearts. فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ إِخْوَانًا, and you were, by the blessing of Allah, made to brothers. So that verse is deep, because they really were enemies, quite literally killing each other. And so they're brought together. Another thing that's very powerful that's going on is people like Bilal al-Habashi, Suhaib al-Rumi, insignificant people in the Arab Jahili understanding. People like Ibn Mas'ud, very insignificant. He was a Confederate. He was not a pure Arab. His mother was an African slave, so he was half black. And the Quraysh looked down on him, and suddenly he's actually a scholar that people are looking up to and respecting. So there's a radical transformation going on in their understanding that is an extraordinary departure from the Jahili tradition. Now, I want to bring our attention to a few points here. One, the Prophet ﷺ did something very extraordinary, which is, again, from his fatana. He did mu'akha, which is uniting the Aus and Khazraj with the Muhajirin through mu'akha. And it's later abrogated. But he actually made a pact between people that was literally, the person became your brother. Literally. He was your brother. And one of the things that Mus'ab's brother Abu Aziz says when he walks past him after Badr and he's clasped, and one of the Ansar was tying his hands, Mus'ab says to him, شُدَّ عَلَيْهِ فَإِنَّ أُمَّهُ غَنِيَّةٌ وَقَدْ تَفْسِيلَهُ, really tighten him, because his mother's got a lot of money. And maybe she'll ransom him with it. And so Abu Aziz says, Ya akhi, هَكَذَا تُوَصِّي عَلَى أَخِيكَ, this is how you tell people to take care of your brother? And he said, لَسْتَ بِأَخِي وَإِنَّمَا هُوَ أَخِي, you're not my brother, he's my brother. And so he's showing, this is an extraordinary thing, because you have to see that in the perspective of the Jahili Arab, where kinship bond was everything. You see, kinship bond was there. It's stronger than anything that most of us can understand about a blood brother. Kinship bond was everything. You would give up your life, not just for your blood brother, but for some distant tribal relationship. And so, really, this is something that people have to really consider this deeply, because this idea of the brotherhood of Islam overrides family and nation and tribe and all of these. These are all Jahili concepts. It honors the blood ties as long as those blood ties do not come into conflict with the deen. If they come into conflict with the deen, those blood ties are severed. And that's why people actually killed their own fathers, which is unbelievable if you think about that. Abu Hudayfa killed Utbah, and Utbah, we'll get to that in a moment, inshallah. But I want to point out a couple of things. One, there's two, the Jews they're watching. The Jews are watching. They're seeing what's going on. There's something else going on here as well. there's two people who are very interesting. One is from the Aus and the other is from Khazraj, right? One of them, and they're both cousins. Abu Amir is the Ausi, and Abdullah ibn Ubay, right, is the Khazraji. These are cousins. Now, Abu Amir wanted wanted spiritual power. He had hubb al-riyasa for spirituality. He considered himself a hanif. He used to wear like a hair cloth, which was a sign of zuhud. He used to have long hair like a zahid. He ate very little. He was emaciated, and he considered himself a spiritual man. He was like a new age type person, right? He saw himself as somebody who was very spiritual. And the other person is Abdullah bin Ubay, he's not interested in spirituality. He's interested in dunya, the secular power. And these are the two powers that human beings have over people: spiritual power and secular power. And this is really important because both of them become obstacles for people seeing the truth. And this is rooted in hubb al-riyasa, love of leadership, which is, according to Sidi Abdul Wahid ibn Ashar, the root disease of the human being. Now, what happens? Abu Amr goes to the Prophet. He wants to see, what are you teaching? He said, I've come with the millah of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He said, no, you haven't. I'm following Ibrahim. You see, now here's his hubb al-riyasa, and he said, and the Prophet grants him that. He says, but I've come with it pure, unadulterated, directly from the heaven. In other words, you have it after it's already been tainted over centuries, and you've lost the way. It's imbalanced. I'm bringing it pure. And he says, Kadibta, you're telling a lie. And then he says, and then he calls a curse. He says, may the one who's lying, this man, Abu Amr says, may the one who's lying be distant, exiled, and let him die alone. And the Prophet said, well, huwa kadhalik. If that's what you want, then let it be so. And so this man ends up taking the few followers that he has. He had spiritual, like his devotees. He's like a guru. And they go off, right? He leaves Medina. So he loses his spiritual authority when the Prophet ﷺ comes. Because إِذَا جَاءَ الْحَقُّ زَهِقَ الْبَاطِلِ. When truth comes, falsehood goes. The false spiritual teacher, when the real spiritual teacher comes in, he shrivels up. Because there's no substance. There's nothing substantial there. But the point of that story is his love of leadership prevented him from seeing the truth, because Allah says that He will divert His signs from those who have kibr in their hearts. فَأَصْرِفُ آيَاتِي عَنِ الَّذِينَ يَتَكَبَّرُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ. I will turn my signs away from those who have kibr, arrogance. I will turn it away from them when it's without بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ. They have no right to do that. So he diverted his signs from this man because of that kibr in his heart, spiritual kibr, spiritual pride. And that's why Imam al-Junayd says that the first obligation is not tawheed, like the mutakallimun say. He said it's to get rid of kibr, because if you don't get rid of kibr, you won't be receptive to tawheed. Allah will not give you tawheed because of your kibr. So now the second person is Abdullah ibn Ubay, right? Who is now the Prophet ﷺ actually once visits him, and this is really interesting. The Prophet on his donkey, he had a himar, which is a sign of mutawadi', because the Arabs did not ride donkeys. Slaves and women rode donkeys. So it's important to see that. This is breaking the Jahili thing. Because Arabs rode burdun, they rode baghla, they rode khayl, they rode jamal. They rode animals that had izzah. They didn't ride animals that were like meek and humble. It was inappropriate. And if you've ever seen like a donkey, you'll know why. I mean, they're very humble little animals. And if you put them next to a mule or a horse, I mean, the contradistinction is very clear. But he rode a donkey, right, out of humility. And so he stopped and he goes out of Abdullah bin Ubay. And they had like fortresses just outside of Medina. And Abdullah ibn Ubay says to him, why do you stay in your house? right? This is his big suggestion. Why don't you just stay in your house, and if people want to come to you, they can come to you, and if they don't, they don't. So at least here it's a suggestion, right? The Quraysh are they were forcing them to do that, to keep in the houses. Whereas here it's a suggestion. And one of the men that was there who becomes, Abdullah bin Rawaha, he becomes one of the great Sahaba. He actually says, no, keep doing what you're doing. We want to hear what you have to say. And this is Abdullah bin Ubay, right? He thinks he's his friend. He's going to support him, and he's really upset. Now he's losing the closest people to him. And so he gets very upset. And when the Prophet ﷺ went away from that, he was obviously troubled, and he goes and he's visiting this sick man, and when he visits him, he says something very significant, right? Sa'ad says to him, be gentle with him, because wallahi, we were making his crown for him before you came. They were going to make him the king of Aus and Khazraj. They were trying to unite the Aus and Khazraj, and he said, we were making his crown before you came. So, in other words, he's just trying to explain the psychological state of the man. He's devastated because he's lost it. But the point is, for me, the point here is hubb al-riyasa, love of leadership. And I would take from this also another ishara, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, is that if you look at the two enemies of Islam, more than anybody, and these are the ones that Allah concerns us with in the Quran, are the Jews and the Christians. And what the Jews want is like Abu Amr. They want spiritual leadership. The Christians, thank you. They want spiritual leadership. They want that they're the ones that have the spiritual monopoly. The Jews aren't interested in spiritual leadership. They don't want people to convert to Judaism. They want secular leadership, because they see themselves as that they are the chosen people and that they should rule the world. And they actually believe that in the end of time, according to their theology, in the end of time, the Messiah comes and establishes them as world rulers. That's part of their theology. So the Jew wants this secular leadership, whereas the Christian wants spiritual leadership. Right? He believes that he has a monopoly on the truth and everybody else is wrong. Right? And so he does not want any other religion to exist alongside of him, with the exception of the Jews, for historical reasons, obviously. So that's archetypal. It doesn't mean the Christians also want secular power and things like that. But then it would be closer to that Jewish phenomenon. Now, another very important event that takes place. There was one of the Jews from Bani Qaynuqa or Qaynaqa or Qayniqa, it has a musallas. One of the Jews from this tribe was Hussein bin Salam. And this man was a rabbi. He was one of their most learned people. And he comes to the Prophet ﷺ. He's actually seen the descriptions of the Prophet. He recognizes him and he says Shahada. The Prophet calls Bani Qaynuqa to his gathering, their leaders. And then he asks them, he names him Abdullah. And he tells him to stay behind a curtain. And then he asks the Jews, what do you say about this man? And they say, Alimuna ibn Alimina. He's the most learned of us, the son of the most learned. And he's one of our Sada. He's a leader. And so Abdullah ibn Salam comes out and he testifies. And they immediately reject him from that. And there were a few other of the Jews that become Muslim also. And the interesting thing about Abdullah bin Salam is he does fight in jihad, and he actually was the one that defended Uthman when the Khawarij attacked his house. He actually stood on the house, on the rooftop, and said, leave this man alone, don't touch him, because wallahi, I saw this man defending the Messenger of Allah, spending his wealth for the Messenger of Allah, and serving Islam in the times when Islam was weak. And they start shouting, kill the Jew. Because he's told him, I was a Jew. كنت رجلا يهوديا. I was a Jewish man. من الله علي بالإسلام. And so he actually dies shaheed. رضي الله عنه. So he is one of the great Sahaba. Now, another really extraordinary event occurs, I think, and that is the adhan. Now, they're beginning to gather for the prayer, and they have to pray 5 times a day, and they need to be called because people are in their houses. So they start debating how they should call, and some suggest using the horn because the Jews used a horn, a ram's horn. And some suggest let's use a naqus, which was wooden. It was like a wooden bell that the Christians were using. And so the Prophet ﷺ agreed on the naqus, the bell, because we're closer to the Christians than the Jews. And so he starts, the naqus is actually being made, and one of the Sahaba, radiallahu anhu, has a dream. And he's in this dream, and it's obviously a true dream, Abdullah bin Zayd, and he actually sees a dream in which the Prophet ﷺ, in which a man comes to him, and he has a naqus, and he asks him for it, and he says, what do you want with it? And he says, I want to call people to the prayer with it. And he says, I'll give you something better than this. And then he teaches him the adhan. And when he goes and tells the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ says, this is a true dream. Now, the Prophet ﷺ then says, go get Bilal, because Bilal was known to have a very powerful voice, which we'll see on Badr. Bilal, radiallahu anhu, is taught these words, and then he calls the prayer. Sayyidina Umar hears the adhan, and he has just had a dream with the same words. So he runs and says, Wallah alladhi ba'athaka bil-haq. I just heard these in a dream. So now, to me, one of the really significant things about this is, one, is really radically diverting the Muslims from these previous traditions, the Jews and the Christians. This is important. He is establishing a new revelation that is freeing itself from all of this tradition that is in the previous teaching. And another thing about it is, if you think about the horn, which is animal, and the naqus, which is vegetative or mineral if it's made out of metal, because the Christians use bells and wood as well. So you have these, the animal, the mineral, and the vegetable as ways of calling people to the prayer. And this is from the world. But Allah gives the human voice as a way to call people to prayer, because it is the human voice that transcends the human being, that takes the human being beyond the animal, vegetable, and mineral. It takes you beyond your bestial nature, your vegetative soul, your animal soul, your mineral soul, and it elevates you to your angelic character or quality. So it is the human voice that becomes the call to the prayer. I mean, that's really extraordinary, I think, that Allah did that. Because, I mean, again, you see, who would think of that, the adhan? Who would think, because you see the Christians doing it, and this is clearly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then also the adhan itself and what it calls people to. As-salatu khayrun min an-nawm. So now the other thing that's very beautiful here is he reminds us of Bilal making the dua. And what he made in the dua when he would see the first light, because this is a time of istijaba, he would make a dua to ask Allah to help the Quraysh. Now I think Allah, the Prophet ﷺ, more happy to see his own tribe who rejected him enter into. But also another thing here is the idea of dua as a form of da'wah. This is something the Muslims have forgotten. That you should make dua that the non-Muslims become Muslims. That we should ask Allah for their guidance. And this is what he was doing. Allah for their guidance. And his prayer was answered by Allah. And he's the one that calls the adhan the day that they all become Muslim in Mecca. From the Kaaba. It's Bilal who calls them. Now, some other events are happening. One of them is the households are being set up. The Prophet ﷺ is the masjid. They build that first masjid, and the first prayer niche was here. And then after Allah reveals, they face. Now the Prophet ﷺ had quarters here, and obviously he doesn't have his 9 wives yet. He has 2 wives at this point, Aisha and Sauda. And here is the Rawda, and here's the Mimbar of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, one of the things that Ibn Abi Jamrah, and I mentioned this before, one of the things that Ibn Abi Jamrah says is one of the wisdoms in the Hijrah was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the Prophet was born in Mecca, had he always stayed in Mecca, people would have thought that Mecca was great, mukarrama, because of Mecca. But even before the Prophet, it was great. But Medina was nothing. It was a insignificant oasis amongst many oasis towns in Arabia. And so by the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ goes from Mecca to Medina, and because of this migration, Mecca becomes greater. Medina, according to Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, becomes greater than Mecca. And his proof is from Sayyidina Umar, who heard a man preferring Mecca over Medina, and he went to find him. He said, "Are you the man preferring Mecca over Medina?" And he said, "Yes." And he prohibited him from doing that, because by consensus, there is no purer spot in the entire universe than the spot that contains the body of the Messenger of Allah. By ijma', that's ijma', according to Qadi Iyad and the Shifa. It is higher. And by consensus, the Masjid of the Prophet, the Rawda is better, because it's actually in Jannah. And there's no place, according to the transmission, that says that there's a part of Jannah in the Kaaba or in Mecca. So there's actually a part of paradise inside the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. Now the reason that this masjid is so exalted is because the Messenger of Allah prayed in it. So it's azuma biman salla fi. It became great because of the one who prayed in it. And the reason that the Rawda is the purest and greatest spot in the entire masjid is because that is where the Prophet went back and forth constantly to his houses. So he spent more time walking on that place than anywhere else in Medina.